We had lost the business. We had no money. My wife was giving birth in 4 weeks. So much can happen in business which disrupts your mind. Now, if you go through business and you fully appreciate and understand that you've signed up to a game, you're in this situation where you learn how to relieve tension from your body. And then when it is time to strike, you've got the energy to do it. What if the whole goal of entrepreneurship, or the biggest benefit, wasn't that you're going to make loads of money and you're going to make a big change, but it was purely this ticket to extreme personal development? What's the most important trait you can pass on to your child? I would say courage. Courage influences everything in your life.
What are some of the mistakes then that you see people making that force them to make decisions from a place of fear rather than a place of courage or abundance?
This is a really interesting thing, right?
Today's one of the most interesting conversations I've had in a long time. I'm speaking with Sebastian Bates, who is the founder of Warrior Academy, which is an international martial arts school for children. Now, that might not sound like a typical guest, but one of the reasons that I invited Sebastian on the podcast is because of the fundamental principles that he teaches and his incredible journey to launching these schools and what we can all learn as creative business owners when it comes to courage and resilience. This is an incredibly powerful conversation. I know you're going to absolutely love it. So stay tuned right to the end. And as always, if you find it valuable, then please hit that subscribe button and share it with a friend. Seb, in 2014, you had a serious base jumping accident where your parachute didn't open properly and you fell more than 50 feet, shattered both your legs, and doctors told you that you may never walk again. I'm curious, how did that event influence how you run your business and your life today?
It certainly filled me with gratitude during that time. So just to kind of give some perspective, I was base jumping for about 2 years, skydiving and base jumping about 2 years, did about 500 skydives, didn't just go straight into base jumping, did about 500 skydives, built up to it, started getting into wingsuit skydiving, then eventually pushed into base jumping. Started base jumping in America, then around Europe, and did several hundred base jumps. And then I had this accident on my 7th jump of the day in Switzerland, where I was jumping alone. So I was jumping with a friend up until that point, and then I was jumping alone. The accident itself, you can't really prepare for an accident like that. Logically, you understand that you're doing something dangerous, right? And these things do happen. And I guess in some way, you come to terms with the worst case scenario. I'm often asked, how can you make the decision to jump? And the only way I can explain that is you fully accept the worst case scenario, right? Which we can talk about later, or just to circle back to that. But as soon as that accident happened, what followed was 2 years of rehabilitation. During those 2 years, the accident wasn't the worst thing. The worst thing to happen to me was watching pretty much most of my friends die. So I had about 15 close friends die in that 2 year period, which left me with loads of survivor's guilt, PTSD, all sorts from the actual accident, which kind of showed up later on in my life, 5 to 8 years later on, when I kind of came to terms with it. The reality of not just the accident, which was kind of the catalyst of the beginning of this very introspective journey throughout my life, was massive, right? It was like that accident kicked off this journey of understanding who I was, what I wanted out of life, how I was living my life, and how that was going to change. Right up until that point, extreme sports and living a life of adventure was my number one priority. After that point, I suddenly realized I was living very selfishly. And ultimately, while it felt amazing to base jump, it's a very selfish sport, right? And people leave behind families when they go through that. Pretty much a few years after that accident, I had a daughter, and I realized that she wouldn't have a dad if I continued doing what I was doing. And so the reality for me was I still had all of this energy that I wanted to put into something, and I was not risk averse in the slightest. I was quite happy to take risk. But the key thing for me was putting it into something constructive. And that's what I did with business. And so very quickly, we went from a very small business in the UK to a business that had close to 100 full-time staff around the world, several £1 million revenue, and had exploded within a 3 to 4 year period afterwards. And I think it really drives you when you have a near-death experience like that, which you're not supposed to survive. I think there was like an 80% chance of death at that height. And I've had friends fall to their death at much lower heights. So I was very lucky, but kind of leaves you with a sense of guilt. Why did you survive, and why didn't other people who are more cautious than me? So gratitude, a feeling of luck, which isn't always healthy. But more than anything, what I realized from a business point of view, I guess, which is one of the questions there, right, was how did it influence my business? Well, I realized that the business, up until that point, it was vital that I was there physically for the business. After that point, I realized that if I was needed physically in the business, I would be stunting the business's growth. And see, what I found within my industry, and you'll find it with loads of industries out there, right? Everyone's got this glass ceiling in their business where you get to this point where you can't grow anymore until you learn to let go. And so one of the beautiful lessons that accident gave me was learning to let go. Learning to let go of base jumping. Learning to let go of, having my body back to how it was before. Learning to let go of seeing people ever again that I had lost. Learning to let go of being in full control and in person of the business, and realizing that in the very physical industry I'm in, teaching martial arts, I had to learn to let go of teaching, right? And so that's what I did. And so once I learned to let go, that's when we started to really expand. If I was always needed there, then the bottom line is that, the buck would kind of stop with me. I'd be the only person who could do this. I'd be the only person who could teach. And so you're in that position where you just simply can't grow. So it was really exciting, actually, after that, once I realized that, because I then saw the business I had as a business owner rather than a kind of founder operator. And it really took off from that point.
Yeah, it's interesting. You said two things there, which I want to touch on. The first one was accepting worst case scenario. And the second one was letting go. And I talk about the courage to let go, because it takes a lot of courage to let go. And so how are those two things linked in your mind?
Yeah, so first of all, courage is such a massive word, right? So in the Warrior Academy, we teach 4,000 kids every single week around the world. I'm a dad of 3 kids. If someone asked me, what's the most important trait you can pass on to your child? I would say courage, above everything else. And I've thought a lot about this. Courage influences everything in your life, every single decision you make, right? It's not just about having the courage to go and take big risks or do big things. It's having the courage to stand up for yourself. It's having the courage to seek from life what you believe you're worth, having the courage to find the right relationship, to build the future you want, right? Having the right courage having the courage to pursue the things that you're most interested in, and often having the courage to challenge the status quo. And I think people who lack courage, they rarely experience total fulfillment in their life, especially in certain areas, right? Relationships or professionally. And so for me, courage is massive. And I've seen so many people live without courage, and they don't really understand what courage is. Courage for me is often confused with confidence. Confidence is a byproduct of courage. You get confidence by showing courage. In the Warrior Academy, when you walk into a dojo, you sit down as a student and there's a circle in front of you. And we have 10 to 12 students in each class. Every circle says around it, courage earns confidence. So there's this constant reminder to all of our students around the whole world that courage earns confidence. It's built into the blueprint of what we teach from the very first class. Every single time they go to a class, they go to that same spot. They look down, they see that, right? So there's this kind of this subliminal messaging going on that we are developing confidence by helping them show courage. So how do you show courage? Well, this is a really interesting thing, right? For me, it's very simple. There's a logical process to actually develop and show courage. You asked about the worst case scenario. That's a piece of it, right? So when I look at courage, I look at it very logically. I accept the worst case scenario. And it's one of the things that I find is that we're sometimes blindsided by fear because we're imagining things going wrong in the future. If you think about anxiety, what actually is anxiety? Well, it's an imagination of things going wrong in the future, right? And so we're stuck in the future, we're not in the present. And so if you removed that, you'd remove fear and you'd be able to be present and you'd have courage. If you're jumping off the cliff and in 3 seconds you've got to open your parachute, you're not thinking about your emails. You're not worried about something going wrong in the future. You're in that moment. You're fully present. You're in a flow state. So you don't necessarily feel the same fear as someone who's anxious about the future. Your fear is very real and it's very in your face, but right? Because you're doing something, but you follow your drills so that you can actually fulfill the kind of skill that you need to survive in that moment. So you're in the present. If you look at business owners and how this translates into business, you might be really worried about the future. And a great example I had was during COVID. Our whole business was shut down in Dubai. 3 months later, our whole business in the UK was shut down. But over here, we didn't have furlough or any support. You're kind of on your own, right? And it was devastating. My wife was 8 months pregnant. It was a really terrifying time. I was stuck in South Africa at the time. I took the last commercial flight back out of South Africa. I was doing a course with Dr. DiMartini to help develop our anti-bullying program. Anyway, when I got back, I suddenly realized I had lost everything. The last 2 years that we were building up and our business basically had to reset. And so what I did, and I would encourage anyone to do this who's worried about anything in the future for their business, is I took a piece of paper. And on that piece of paper, I sat down and I drew on my past within martial arts and base jumping and understanding what fear was and how to develop courage. This is a very simple exercise. And on that piece of paper, I wrote down every single thing that could go wrong. And I'm talking as extreme as you can possibly get. Because in our minds, we've got this concern of the future, which is building our anxiety up, right? This imagination. So get that onto paper. And this paper, this A4 piece of paper, suddenly got filled with bullet points of everything that could possibly go wrong, right? So all that worry and concern was now on the paper. I turned it over and then I wrote down exactly what I would do if that was going to happen. And it took me about an hour and a half, right, to try and figure out, okay, if this happens, there's a medical problem, there's an economical problem, there's a, time problem, whatever it is. I didn't get off the chair until I'd completely come to terms with the worst case scenario. We had lost the business. We had no money. My wife was giving birth in 4 weeks, right? I didn't get off that chair until I was completely satisfied. Then I took that piece of paper, opened a drawer, put it in the drawer on the desk, got a new piece of paper out. Now, because I'd fully accepted the worst case scenario, all of my energy and thought process could go into the imagination of things going right. So I've removed the anxiety and now I can replace it with excitement. So now I made a list of everything I want to happen. I turned that piece of paper over and then I made a plan for it. We executed that plan. Within 3 months, I had built 2 new 6-figure businesses, completely unrelated to martial arts, which is another exciting story when it comes to entrepreneurs and thinking creatively when you absolutely have to, right? And within 2 years, we were the largest martial arts academy in the Middle East. And I put it down to capitalizing on some of the lowest points of my life and understanding where courage comes into it and how to logically feel courage so you can actually follow through with the things you need to do.
Mm. And so what are some of the mistakes then that you see people making that force them to make decisions from a place of fear rather than a place of courage or abundance?
I think people are often reactive. One of the best bits of advice I ever had was sleep on it. And it's so simple, right? But it's like, if you can somehow find a way to delay the time it takes from some bad news coming in to you having to make a decision, just find a way to delay that as long as you can, realistically, right? Even if it's just a day or just one night, your whole perspective is very different. Because often what you find is when you get some bad news in the moment, you're suddenly in this situation where you feel like you need to solve it straight away, but you're reacting reactively and emotionally. And it's not you're often acting, from a scarcity point of view, which just fuels your kind of the fear you've got. So that's one very practical step. The other thing I say is breathing techniques. When I used to stand on the edge of the cliff base jumping, I had a mentor who would say to me, look, when you stand on the edge of the cliff, you should be able to stand on one leg. Because when you do it on ground, if you and me were to stand up here right now, I don't know how good your balance is, but if you can stand up right now, okay, you should be able to balance on one leg for 20 seconds, 30 seconds, and it shouldn't be a problem. You should even be able to do it with your eyes closed. But if I ask you to stand right on the edge of that table, okay, and do exactly the same thing, to your body, it's no different. But to your mind, you're now a little bit higher up, you're standing at the edge of the table and your eyes are closed. If I told you to do it on top of this building, it'd be even worse, right? And so what I found was the advice I was given was if you can learn how to control your breathing on the ground, and then you can do it up there as well, you're in this position where if you can stop your legs from shaking, because your sympathetic nervous system literally starts making your legs shake when you're an exit point, because it's like, this is a bad idea. Yeah. But if you can find a way to control your breathing and bring that down, suddenly you're in a much better place to make a right decision. And what I would say to myself is if I can't control my breathing on the edge of a cliff, I won't jump. And I've walked away from some jumps simply because I couldn't control my breathing. But if I can control my breathing, the same if you're public speaking or whatever it is, right? If you just slow that breathing right down, suddenly you're in a position where you can actually make a much better move or decision. after that point, it's so much easier. So those two things I would say, delaying the decision-making process just slightly, even just sleeping on it one day so that you're then in control of your emotions. And if you have to make a decision then and there in the moment, take 2 minutes to breathe. Slow your breathing down straight away. Those two things, I think, they're so simple, but they make such a difference.
It's about like controlling your nervous system essentially and not going into that sort of fight or flight and then letting that influence the decisions that you're making essentially.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, we have more control over that than we think.
Yeah. And I don't think people realize that. Like, I'm fortunate enough in a weird way to have experienced panic attacks and like extreme anxiety. So I was forced to learn how to control that.
Yeah.
But even things like breath work for me have just been like so foundational in lowering that anxiety and also just kind of getting back into that, they call it like rest and digest phase, right? Rather than the fight and flight. Talk to me about abundance thinking versus scarcity thinking in the context of business. So I'll give you a specific example. I teach some of these principles to my clients and they kind of often come back with this concept of it's all very well, but like I haven't got any more projects in the pipeline. So how can I raise my rates with this client? Like they might leave and then what do I do? Like talk to me about your philosophy or your principles around making decisions based on what you want and what you're trying to move towards rather than what you're trying to move away from.
Scarcity is like this contagious thing. I really see it like it's contagious, right? Like sometimes I walk into a room and you can feel it in the air. With you speak to a group of people and you know they're worried about tax or they're worried about this, maybe not here, but they're worried about tax, they're worried about that or this or something on the news has disrupted them emotionally, right? And suddenly the conversation turns to this kind of scarcity thing. And I've been in WhatsApp groups in the past and stuff where the conversation's been so much around scarcity that even if I entered it in an abundance mode, I've then left and start to go into the spreadsheets and try and make cuts to expenses and all sorts. And I'm like, wow, isn't that incredible? Just because it's like this infectious, you know, contagious feeling that us human beings have. It's a bit like being in a tribe and, you know, you're a caveman in a cave and someone's telling you there's a lion outside, all this sort of stuff. And you immediately start worrying and it just kind of brings you back to that animalistic concern when actually it might be completely unfounded. So that's the first thing I'd say is being really, really aware of who you surround yourself with and being able to identify it. Like with my close friends, I pick them up on anytime they're talking in a scarcity point of view, you know, and it's really easy for them to, or anyone to kind of slip into it. But if your friends hold you accountable, so much easier just to quickly snap out for your benefit and for theirs. So that's a really important one there. How do you maintain an abundance mindset? I think your environment really dictates that a lot of the time. So outside of the community and the human beings you surround yourself with, where you are is really key. I spend the first hour of my day outside every day. I watch the sunrise every single day. I think that gives me perspective. You know, and I think perspective is a key aspect of an abundance mindset as well, right? It's understanding how lucky you are in your life and to have this deep sense of gratitude. And I don't just mean, you know, writing down something you're grateful for. I mean, really feeling a deep sense of gratitude. And one of the best ways, and this might sound, you know, a strange bit of advice, but I'll do it from the perspective that I've had, right? I've built a charity. And one of the greatest gifts that charity and donating to this charity so much has given me is gratitude. And that one of the greatest benefits of gratitude is a different perspective. One of the greatest knock-on effects of having a different perspective filled with gratitude is this abundance mindset. I'm not in scarcity because I realized what an abundant place I live, how lucky I am, how lucky my wife and kids are, you know, how great it is to live in today's world and where I am and all this sort of stuff. And it's really hard to feel scarcity when you feel gratitude. And if you're donating or looking after someone who's less fortunate than yourself, then you're thrown into that perspective straight away. And so that's one of the things I've definitely noticed. And, you know, I've seen that in entrepreneurs who do donate a lot and you know, not just money, but time as well to look after people around them. We can get so wrapped up in our own problems, can't we? And then we're trapped in scarcity. It's so easy to do that.
Yeah. I heard Tony Robbins say once that all emotional suffering is a result of too much focus on yourself.
Yeah.
And it's just like you get so wrapped up in your own problems that you just lose perspective of the entire world, basically. There's two things that you said there, which I think are really interesting, like getting that perspective in terms of how privileged you are, but also kind of going back to this this like worst case scenario, there was a thing I heard, I think it was from Stoicism years ago, which was this concept of practicing poverty and actually going and putting yourself in situations that you think is maybe the worst case scenario.
Yeah.
Like, you know, some of my clients, when they go through exercise, they're like, oh, I'd lose my house and I'd have nowhere to live. Really? Like, is that actually what would happen? And okay, well, why don't you play that out? Like, what would it be like to spend a week on the streets in the UK and, you know, go and see what that's like? And then all of a sudden they're like, oh yeah, I didn't actually die and I am quite resourceful and I know how to ask for help. And, you know, I have all of these skills that are basically survival skills, right? And like, I can survive. And this idea of all these things happening aren't actually reality. Like that is actually just happening in my mind, and it's causing this physical reaction. And then that influences the decisions that I make. And then, you know, I'm kind of stuck in this cycle. And like you said, it's almost that fear or that regret of not having the courage to do that thing. And looking back on your life thinking, well, what would it have been like if I had fired that client or gone and approached that client or let go of that team member, or what, you know, whatever the thing is that you're kind of thinking of doing or worrying about doing, like what would the other side of that been like? I'm just curious, is that the kind of thing when you talk about facing death, I guess, and coming to terms with the fact that we are mortal and, you know, really understanding that it can be taken away from you, is that the kind of thing that helps you with that perspective and knowing that, you know, really there isn't anything to lose other than the people close to you and the people that you care about, like when it comes to actually making these bigger decisions in business?
Definitely. I think the if you look at any of the warrior races, right, like the samurai, the Vikings, they all used to meditate on death. They would imagine their death every single day. You know, they would, if you imagine all the time you're thinking about the fact that you might die and you fully accept that, what could possibly stir you, right? Like, you're sending these samurai into war and it's like they've already accepted their worst case scenario fate, you know, and I think obviously that's extreme, right? But you can take that with a pinch of salt and say to yourself, well, if you really appreciate the impermanence of life, suddenly your life, all the little things in your life become even more valuable, right? And, you know, I read something the other day which was really interesting and fairly profound. It was every time you say goodnight to your kids, they're in bed, you put your kids to bed, you say goodnight to them. Imagine that's the last time you do it. Then you don't mind reading an extra bedtime story. Do you know what I mean? You don't mind the sleepless nights, all this sort of stuff from a parent's perspective. And so, you know, I think having an awareness of the impermanence of life gives you a very deep appreciation for the most simple things in life. And I love what you said about practicing poverty. And that's kind of the premise of Ramadan, right? With the Islamic faith. You know, for a whole month, it's like living way under your means and focusing on giving back and looking after people around you in your community and meditating and understanding and thinking about and praying around that concept of going back to basics. And I think that's, you know, when you look at, there's various religions do this, right? I think Lent in the Christian religion and many others as well, you know, they're built in for a reason. Right. And it's like, well, there's a lot to learn from that, I think. Yeah,
absolutely. I want to talk about the foundation a little bit more in a minute. But before we do that, what have you learned from martial arts that you bring into your business on a daily or weekly basis?
So much. Well, there are so many parallels between martial arts, extreme sports, and entrepreneurship, which I could just talk about all day. The first thing I would say is how being relaxed and fluid is so key, right? Like I found there was a period after COVID where I felt like I had all this tension in my body, right? And it was like I had been fighting for so long. After COVID, it was just like one thing after the other, putting out this fire, then that fire, then that fire. And even when things started being really good, I was in this state of tension. You go into a boxing match or a martial arts match or in a Thai boxing match, whatever it is, if you're tense, you'll be exhausted. And so the trick to throwing a really powerful punch that strikes hard and is fast is to be completely relaxed. And then just on the moment of impact, you tense. And that is when you get the maximum speed with the maximum delivery of power, right? Now, if you translate that into business, so much can happen in business which disrupts your mind and causes tension in your body and your mind and everything. And it will cause burnout. It will make you sick. It will make you stressed. It will make you worried. It will make you anxious. It will paralyze you from making positive decisions. It will force you into scarcity mode. Now, if you go through business and you fully appreciate and understand that you have signed up to a game and you learn how to breathe through things, you learn the basics of sleeping on big decisions, you learn about how you can use the people around you to help you, use the resources, right? You're in this situation where you learn how to relieve tension from your body. And then when it is time to strike, because you haven't been tense all this time, you've got the energy to do it. And then suddenly, bang, 15-hour day, no problem. And it won't burn you out, right? You need to go and deliver a big pitch somewhere, you can do that no problem, right? You need to go and put in some hours or put in some extra work or do something uncomfortable. It's not something that's going to tip you over the edge because you've maintained this state of, being stress-free and tension-free. And I'm not saying, try and live without stress. I don't believe in work-life balance. I think that if you want to achieve anything, you need to ultimately take on a huge amount of stress to do that, right? But there's taking on needed stress and there's taking on stress which you could probably do without. I think that pressure's got a bad rap in society. I think that we try so much to protect ourselves from pressure. There's this huge emphasis on removing pressure from our lives and trying to live every single day without pressure. And I totally disagree with it. I think that the pressure that you're willing to experience in life directly correlates to the success that you'll no doubt experience in life by being able to have and take on more pressure. The trick of what we should be focusing on is not removing pressure, but learning how to cope with more, right? And part of that is learning how to remove tension from your body. And that is something I've learned from martial arts and carry over into business.
Yeah, it's really interesting because sometimes clients get to the point where they do burn out and I basically tell them to go and take a holiday. And when they come back from that holiday, 9 times out of 10, that's when they have their breakthrough.
Yeah.
Because they've learned to relax into it and they realized, oh, I went on holiday and the business is still here. All these problems I left with are still here. Clients are still pestering me for stuff. Nothing really happened and I felt really relaxed on this holiday. And so I think that's a really interesting point. And I also think from a creativity perspective, we don't do our best creative work when we're stressed and when we're tense. We do our best creative work when we're in flow and when we're relaxed. And that's when we come up with our best ideas. And that's often why people say, oh, I come up with this idea in the shower because we're not thinking about that stuff. We're having a shower, right?
I think it's knowing when you do your most creative work as well.
Yeah.
And then there's other things you can do as well. Like as soon as you possibly can in your business, get an assistant.
Yeah.
Like that has been a complete game changer for me. A really good assistant knows how to protect your headspace. What more important thing is there to an entrepreneur's decision-making process than their headspace being protected, right? Like if you're really stressed and this great opportunity comes along, you're going to make a bad decision on it. Either you won't take the risk because you're too scared, you have the courage to take the risk, or you make a wrong decision because you're overthinking things, you're too stressed about it, or whatever it is, right? Or you're not thinking abundantly, so you don't think as creatively. When your business grows, and I've really experienced this, like in the last few years, we went from about 30 full-time to about almost 100 full-time, right? And in that process, suddenly you realize that everything comes at you from every single angle. And, there's 2 things that have really helped with that. One is having an assistant, just practically, who can just say everything goes through them first, and then it goes to you. It's not just having an assistant, but having people on the team who can deal with a disaster and have the power and authority to do that before it gets to you. But understanding where you're at and like, okay, this is the time he needs to protect his headspace and so that he can make revenue generating decisions. And if something comes in, which is HR related, that's going to throw you off, it's not a good idea, is it? That's one of the first things I would say. The second thing I would say is understanding and being able to prioritize stress as well. Some things are not a big deal and they feel like they are in the moment, right? And one of the things that I love most about entrepreneurship is it's this extreme journey of personal development. And I've grown so much because of it. Like every problem I've just grown through. It hasn't stopped me. I don't know how else to live, but this is just what I do, right? I've been an entrepreneur since I was 19. I've just been building businesses since then. And every time I meet an entrepreneur who's been an entrepreneur for several years, you can see the personal development shine through, right? And so what if the whole goal of entrepreneurship or the biggest benefit wasn't that you're going to make loads of money and, you're going to make a big change, but it was purely this ticket to extreme personal development? What if it wasn't about the business? It was about becoming the guy who could build that business. And if we looked at it that way and we had a bit of a sense of humor as we go along this journey, it would make such a difference, which brings me to the third thing, having a sense of humor, right? Because me, like everything, I bring humor into everything I do. It's actually one of the things I look for when I hire a close team, that people have a sense of humor because, things can get quite serious at work. And especially when you're running a charity and then, you're hiring lots of people and you're growing very quickly and, you know, all this sort of stuff. There's pressure. And I think having humor is so important. And sometimes all it takes when you're a bit stressed is having someone next to you who's got a bit of humor and you just snap out of it and it pulls you out. And from the age of 16 to 18, I was in the Royal Marines Reserves, and they've got something called a mantra they use called cheerfulness in the face of adversity. And basically, you know, if you can have a bit of banter when you're in some of your darkest points, you know, I've seen in every kind of elite performance group I've been in, whether it's business or it's professional Thai boxing or it's base jumping, there's always been that element of banter, which can really pull you out of a dark headspace. It might not work for everyone, but it certainly worked for me. And it's something I've carried on with what I do day to day.
Yeah, I think it's really important. And also getting that perspective as well. You know, it's like when it feels really dark and heavy and then you laugh, it just kind of changes your perspective and you're like, oh yeah, actually, this isn't the worst thing in the world. You know, like this will pass and we will look back and laugh on it. And if you can laugh on it now, then even better, right?
And there's a really good point there as well, because it's looking back, right? Like you want to build your courage. Develop a ridiculous list of times where you've shown courage. I'll give you a good example. My daughter, she was going to go to school and she had to sing in front of everyone at school. And she was crying in the morning. She was terrified. She didn't want to do it, all this sort of stuff. And I sat her down and said, look, you don't need to do it. Okay. But what I want you to do is I want you to think about that time when I went skiing with you last year. And she was 6 and she was going down red runs with me, right? And I said to her, do you remember that time you went skiing and you were really scared and you got on the ski lift and you had a few tears because you were worried about it. You went down with me and then we did it again and you went down on your own. And we went up a third time and you fell over when you did it and you really hurt yourself. But you jumped back up and you carried on skiing. And we talked about that. And I brought her headspace into that moment where she fell over, she jumped back up. And I was like, how did that feel? And she was like, well, I was really scared. I was really scared that I couldn't do it. And I was like, and what happened? Okay, well, I did it. And that little story, that experience becomes a piece of evidence that she can reflect back on, which shows that she's brave, right? She's proven to herself that she's brave. And so with that new reframe, she went into school and did the thing, right? She was singing in front of everyone, no problem, came home, so happy she did it. And now the singing becomes another piece of evidence. And so one of the things I like to do is, especially with our students, but anyone can do it, right, is look for pieces of evidence in your past that have proven to yourself that you have courage. Make a list of them, right? And then you've got this undeniable stack of evidence that you do have courage, which you can reflect back on. And I think looking back is such a key way of doing it because we've all got that, right?
Yeah, absolutely. So the business was growing. How many locations did you have in the UK before you moved to Dubai?
We were renting a lot of school halls, village halls, that sort of stuff.
Yeah.
So probably about 10 different locations in the UK with about 500 students.
Okay. And so you were expanding, you get over here, you carry on building it, you carry on expanding. And then one day you sit down and you say, it's not enough to impact children's lives and change their trajectory for generations to come. I want to start a foundation. What was the thought process behind that? Okay,
so the first thing I would say is in the concept of giving away free tuition, which is basically what we're doing in the Warrior Academy, right? For our scholarships, which is what a scholarship is, free tuition. We started that in the UK about 10 years ago, where I said to my team, you can give 10% of our class spaces out for free to anyone that you think would really benefit but can't afford it. So we partnered with children's hospices where we gave tuition to the siblings of children who were terminally ill. So we were mentoring them through, the devastating situation they were in, as well as the passing of their siblings and the family as well. Welfare officers who were sending us people who were going through really difficult financial times, or some of them were fairly extreme cases of children who were going through depression and some even suicidal. We partnered with the armed forces in the UK to mentor the children of parents who were going away for 6 months at a time on tour. So we did all this and we kept it a complete secret because I didn't want loads of people suddenly applying and then us, not being able to fulfill this promise to everyone. So we just said, right, 10%. But it had such an impact on my team and on the feeling we had in the Warrior Academy that as we moved to Dubai, I wanted to scale the concept of a scholarship. But instead of just doing it locally here in the UAE, giving out free tuition, I wanted to take that concept and scale it and place it in some of the most devastating and challenging living environments in the world and work with vulnerable children. And so we're talking the biggest slums on the planet, homeless shelters where kids are addicted to drugs and alcohol, malnourished, war-torn countries, favelas of Rio, the slums of India, boarding schools in the foothills of the Himalayas, all over the world, right? And that was the concept. And so I traveled to Kenya, and I went to a little place in Nairobi called Tika. And there was a homeless shelter there where there were 30 boys who had been rescued from the streets. A lot of these boys had run away from home, or they were looking for food, typically looking for opportunities for food or money on trains, that sort of stuff, to buy and sell things, that sort of thing. But they get onto a train a lot of the time, and then from rural Kenya, and then that train would end up in Nairobi. They'd get out and they'd be lost. And they wouldn't know how to get home. They wouldn't know the details of where they live. They were too young, right? 7 to 9 year old boys. And so they'd be untraceable. There'd be no way for them to get back home. And so these homeless boys then end up in gangs. They would sleep along the railways, under like fruit stalls at railway stations, that sort of stuff. They would eventually find their way into, drugs and alcohol, glue sniffing, all this sort of stuff. By the time they were found by this homeless shelter, they would be addicted to glue. They would be now malnourished. They would have burns and scratches all over them. They would have been beaten up by the gangs or by the police or whoever would have found them homeless. So they had this disdain for authority. And this incredible charity that we found would bring them off the streets, would give them love, care, attention, medicine, so loads of medical care, as well as a kind of a social development program to help educate them as well. And their job was to try and work with them for 6 months and then to place them into full-time education, while they then try and find out little clues to discover where their families are so they can rehome them. And so I went there to Kenya, and I remember meeting these boys for the first time. And what they had done is, in a farm area, they had converted a pigsty into a classroom. So they kicked the pigs out, swept it, and they put some, chairs in there. And so this is where they were learning. And, I look around the room and you can see these boys who are much smaller than other boys their age because they're malnourished. And, it's fairly devastating and very sad to see. And I remember sat on this wooden chair speaking to them all. And my thought was, okay, this is going to be our first scholarship club, our first kind of Warrior Academy club in Kenya. And then looking at the scale of the problem that I faced in front of me, I just felt complete imposter syndrome. I was like, how can I possibly make a dent here? How can I make an impact into the huge issue they're facing? And then what I did is I gave one of the boys called Jeremy a uniform because he did really well. So we awarded him with a uniform, right? And his face completely lit up. And up until that point, he hadn't really smiled. And his face completely, this is the first time he had been given new clothes in his life. And his face completely lit up. And he put it on. And I remember realizing in that moment that kids have incredible imaginations. It's not about the clothes, it's about what it represents. When he put those clothes on, he was turning into a martial artist. At that point, Jeremy went from being a homeless child in Thika to being a martial artist on a black belt journey with a black belt instructor and, a 6 to 8 year journey systematically to develop his character. And I started to realize, well, I can't change the huge societal issues that exist within a slum area or within a third world country. If I want to change Jeremy's life as a child, I need to influence the decisions he makes, because they do get a shot. They get transitioned into full-time education, but they typically run away because they've got this disdain for authority, right? They run away from authority because of all the bad experiences they've had. They end up back on the streets, back on gangs, and if they're lucky, back into this center. So what we needed to do was change his mindset. And if there's one single thing that I know how to do, is to develop a child's character. And I realized that character development is the most important but often missing aspect of a child's education, because it simply, influences every single decision a child makes. If we can develop Jeremy's character, he'll stick at school. If he sticks at school, he'll get an education. If he does that, he might get a job or a better opportunity in life. It would pull him out of the slums, away from homelessness. And so that's what we did. And it was remarkable. We transitioned these 30 boys into full-time education. And then within the school they went to, we had another club, which would then mentor them further and make them into assistant instructors. So they felt this sense of belonging. And that small idea, where I felt that imposter syndrome sitting on the chair with these 30 boys in front of me, transitioned into us now sponsoring over 4,000 vulnerable children, just like Jeremy, in some of the biggest slums on the planet. You know, the biggest slums in Asia, the biggest slums in India, in Africa, the favelas of Rio, the foothills of Himalayas. We're in the villages in Fiji, the jungles of Sri Lanka. We're in communication right now with 25 orphanages in Ukraine to launch over there. We're in communication with orphanages in Haiti. We've just opened up in Uganda. We've got Tanzania on the horizon. All over the world, Bates Foundation clubs are now cropping up with that same concept, right? That if we can develop a child's character, we can influence their life.
Yeah, it's an amazing story. And obviously part of the reason I'm part of the Bates Foundation and joined as a patron is for things like that, and to actually know that the money that we contribute has that impact and has that effect on people. And I think it's one of the few charities that I've ever seen that is able to tangibly demonstrate not only the transformation, but the long-term benefit and results of those interventions, essentially. Yeah. You mentioned just there about you feeling imposter syndrome, which I think is really interesting, because like just from knowing you, I can't imagine Seb having imposter syndrome.
It's only for 30 seconds.
Yeah. But when you had that, like, what was it that allowed you to shift your perspective? Because I hear imposter syndrome almost every day with creatives, and I'm dealing with people who are like, you know, ex-Disney VPs, used to work at Spotify, like have incredible experience. They're incredible at what they do. But when it comes to business and you put them in a business context, it's like they feel they just can't do anything, or they're like back to square one or back at school. Like, so is there anything that you've seen either for yourself personally or for the kids that you work with, or the business groups that you're part of, in terms of imposter syndrome and how to change your perspective on that? Yeah,
sure. I think a lot of people have very different opinions about imposter syndrome. I quite like it. I think that if I feel imposter syndrome, the feeling of like, I'm not ready for this. That's basically what we're talking about, right? I'm not ready for this. I can't do this. That is the indication to me that you are leaving the comfort zone. And it's really key that people understand what the comfort zone is actually about, because everyone has this idea of there's the comfort zone and then you leave it and that's it, right? That's where the good stuff happens. Comfort zone, you know, like classic drawing, right? Maybe you can do an animation here. Yeah. Comfort zone, where all the good stuff happens. And it's like, okay, that's the comfort zone. Here's how it actually works, right? You got the circle, you got the comfort zone. Nothing really happens there. There's no development. And because you're not growing, you're probably slowing down or decaying, right? Because we're always in a state of movement. So you're kind of just bouncing about in this state of no growth. And then you leave the comfort zone, you do something uncomfortable. And a lot of people at this stage then feel imposter syndrome. They go into what's called the high performance zone. Imagine a second circle around it, right? In the high performance zone, you are doing something that's within your abilities, but feels uncomfortable. After that, if you keep pushing, you leave the high performance zone into the hyper anxiety zone. At that stage, you're now doing something that's uncomfortable and also outside of your ability. And so the trick is understanding how to access the high performance zone. Now, if you've got a really good mentor, and look at our instructors as a great example, they will take a very shy child, they'll take them into the high performance zone, and then they'll take them back out into the comfort zone. So it's a bit like going to the gym. You break down the muscles, right? You go back in and then you recover, right? A bad mentor will push someone so far that they break. They had such a bad experience in the hyperanxiety stage that they go back into the comfort zone. They never want to leave again. And so the trick to being a great mentor in developing someone's courage and their confidence and teaching them how to leave the comfort zone is teaching them that it's actually the process of learning is this. It's understanding that it's normal to feel uncomfortable and you should feel uncomfortable. And we need to teach kids that they should feel uncomfortable. We need to remove bubble wrap and teach them that pressure is good. And we need to feel pressure to grow. And we need to understand how we can cope with pressure so that we can stay in that high performance zone for longer before then returning to the comfort zone to solidify the learning, build up the courage again to go and repeat it, right? So you understand this is a process that repeats. And so that's really key. Now, when you look at the imposter syndrome, for me, and you can look at it, lots of people look at it different ways. For me personally, people get confused with leaving their comfort zone and being in that high performance zone and that being imposter syndrome, because they haven't done it enough times. Right. And so if you look at someone and you say, I can't imagine you in having imposter syndrome, it's probably because that person's been in and out of the comfort zone into high performance zone so many times that they understand what that looks like. They understand what uncomfortable looks like. And, once you get to terms with that, it's a process you're quite happy to repeat. And so one of the analogies I like to use is it's a bit like driving a car, right? Imagine we're driving a car right now. You've got a Lambo, I've got a Ferrari. We're in the comfort zone, and we're driving in the comfort zone, 30 miles an hour, nice and steady. Then we're going to go fast, right? Probably not down Shakeside Road, but somewhere. We're on a racetrack, okay? Yeah. We're going fast, and we're pushing these cars as fast as we can. For a lot of people, they'll get to 150 miles an hour or something, and they'll be like, whoa, I need to slow down, that's too much. But you may not have even got into the red at that stage, right? And so the trick is getting as close to that red as possible without breaking the car and burning it out. But understanding that the car can actually shake quite a bit before you need to slow down, right? And so I kind of see it like a revometer, right? It's like, goes up there. How far can you take it? How far can I take this? And now I'm going to go back and chill.
And what are some of the signs that I need to look for that are on the edge of the high performance zone before I move into the high anxiety zone?
So from a business perspective, can you actually deliver what you're promising? Right? Now, you shouldn't be selling something you don't think you can deliver, or be upfront enough to say, look, this is the first time I'm doing this. Okay. I think that a lot of people feel imposter syndrome if they know deep down they can't deliver on their promises. And that's wrong. That's unethical. That's immoral. From a business perspective, it's understanding that really leaving that comfort zone is that process that you repeat. And I think that there are certain things that tell you as a business owner that you're uncomfortable, right? The anxiety, all this sort of stuff that you might be feeling around making a decision. If you've implemented all the things that you possibly can to teach yourself that you can actually cope with stress and anxiety, and even going back and having that list of evidence as one of them, the breathing techniques, the sleeping on it, the delaying the decision-making process, the perspective that we talked about, the deeper sense of gratitude, having a sense of humor, the removing tension from the body. If you've done all of that and you're still in a complete state, then probably best you hang out in the comfort zone a little bit longer and maybe do something a little bit smaller, right? Like I didn't go from never skydiving or never base jumping to just going and doing a base jump. I would have died straight away on the first jump. I did about 500 jumps before I did that, right? You build up to things gradually. One of the things I like to say is you can get used to anything. Doesn't matter what it is. That could be public speaking. It could be anything. It could be base jumping. It could be fighting, whatever it is. You can get used to anything, providing you follow that process that I mentioned of leaving the comfort zone into the high performance zone and using those techniques to actually calm yourself down when you do it. And it's a process you can carry over to everything in life. It's not just business. It's every single thing in your life. This is why everything stems from courage and understanding practically on how to leverage different things in your life to feel more courage.
Yeah, I love that. Just on this note, because I find this fascinating, because there's a difference between being uncomfortable whilst learning a new skill and just being uncomfortable in general, sort of running your business because you're too stressed or whatever. So like one thing I find really fascinating is people's inability to draw from other areas of their life or other experience. Like they've just been leading a team at Disney and then now they've got to jump on a sales call they've set up their own business and now they've got to jump on a sales call. And it's like everything just goes out the window. Like, I'm trying to learn this new sort of framework for selling, but I'm really uncomfortable challenging people's objections. And so how do you apply what we've just talked about to learning new skills and actually practicing them in a kind of real world environment?
Yeah. So if I sat down, imagine you were going to go for a Thai boxing fight, right? Professional Thai boxing fight. And I sat down and we spent 3 hours here and I taught you everything about how to feel more courage, how to logically do things, how to calm your breathing down, how to do all the special little ninja moves that we've got. And then I said, right, you're ready, off you go. You'd be like, you'd suddenly be overwhelmed, start sweating, have a panic attack, right? Yeah. I'm not doing that, right? Yeah. So you've just got to get your reps in. Right. The uncomfortable reality is that you just got to get your reps in. You've got to go and do 3 hours, 4 hours every day doing the same kick on the punch bag every single day for months. And then maybe you're ready for an amateur fight. And then you can go up to professional fight and so on, right? And so it's the same thing with business, right? You can't just suddenly, just because you know how to do stuff, then suddenly be able to do it. You just got to be uncomfortable 1,000 times.
And so in that instance around sales, I'm assuming what you're kind of alluding to is maybe practicing on, say, smaller clients or even like with somebody else or...
Yeah, what I'm basically saying is this. a lot of people think that they've got to be good at it because they understand that they need to do that thing. So they're like, okay, now I've got to be good at it, but it feels uncomfortable. So they start saying to themselves, I can't do this. This feels too uncomfortable. But they didn't realize that they've got to feel uncomfortable 1,000 times.
Right.
If you're doing loads of sales calls, we used to phone up schools in UK or UAE, and I would phone up 300 schools, and I would get 200. I got 298 no's in Dubai. They didn't want us, and 2 schools said yes. And now schools are inviting us every single week to try and work with them. We don't typically work with schools. We do assemblies, that sort of stuff. But essentially, it's if you're understanding when you're fairly new at something, is that you're collecting no's. Your perspective shifts from I should have a yes or this should feel comfortable to I'm going to do something and it's probably going to feel uncomfortable and that's okay. Rather than I'm going to do something, it should feel good and I should feel fine, and then judging yourself that you performed horrendously for it, right? Go into something that you don't like doing, that you know you need to do, and have that perspective that you're going to do something, it's going to be uncomfortable. And give yourself a pat on the back afterwards, have a way to relax afterwards, celebrate that you've done it, and then say to yourself, Monday morning, I'm going to do the same thing. Tuesday, I'm going to do the same thing. Wednesday, same thing. And it's showing up every day. And suddenly, that uncomfortability starts dropping down because you're just so used to it. Your skin gets tougher. And everyone wants a hack, right? Like a confidence hack, like a courage hack. There it is. Do the thing that scares you like 1,000 times.
Yeah, that is such a great perspective shift, because I was talking to this about my clients the other day. It's like, how do you measure success? And far too many people, they start a process, they want to get better at sales, and then they come, I haven't made a sale yet. It's like, well, if you just want to get better at sales and you're measuring when you're good at sales is when you make a sale, then you're missing out everything in the middle. Yeah. And like what I just got from that perspective shift was your measurement should be, how many times have I felt uncomfortable today? Yeah. How many times have I managed to get on a call and push someone around an objection, or have I now presented my proposal and asked them if they want to move forward on the call instead of sending it via email? Like, that's what I should be measuring my success about, not have I actually closed the deal. Also, it gives you a different energy when you go in, right? You haven't got the same nervous energy. You're a bit like, look, this is what I've got. I really care about this. It's going to be great and all that sort of stuff. But you're not fully judging your success or failure based on them saying yes or no. You're rewarding the effort over the achievement, right? And I say this to parents with kids as well, because if you constantly reward or praise a child when they achieve something, that's where they gain their self-worth from, rather than rewarding or praising them from putting the effort in. And what's more important, because if you've got a high achieving child who's terrified of not achieving something when things start getting tougher when they're adults, right? Then they'll be in a position where they don't want to try new things. But if you've got a child who loves the idea of collecting no's, going through failure, and then finally winning, you've got someone who has just got a completely different character, a black belt character, right? Someone who's not afraid to take risks. Someone who's going to put themselves on the line, who's going to take on pressure, because their whole approach, their mindset is totally different to those things. So try and have that when you're approaching something. The goal is not the thing. It's being the person who can get the thing. I love that. Seb, what's next? Because you've got some serious momentum already. Like, what do you want? What message do you want people to take away from this podcast, and how can they learn more about you or kind of get involved and help you on your mission in some way? We've got some incredible things coming up with the charity. We're doing our first scholarship tour, which is really exciting. I'm now taking groups of entrepreneurs on ski trips around the world as well, which is really great for the charity as well. With the Warrior Academy UAE, we're launching a brand new academy. We're signing the lease this week. We've been invited by Nikhil to open up in an incredible location, so I'm excited about that. What do I want people to think when they leave this? I would say that courage earns confidence, that there is a process to have courage, a very logical process to have courage. Hopefully I've given about 10 to 15 steps here that people can actually practically implement, but this entire podcast is totally useless if it was just about entertainment. Take 3 things from this podcast that I've said and actually try it tomorrow or today, and don't beat yourself up for not achieving the thing. Reward yourself for actually trying. Don't be as hard on yourself. Have a sense of humor. Try and remove tension from your body, and be like water with business and in life, and you'll find that you pack a much, much harder punch. Dude, thank you so much for being a guest on the Creative Courage podcast. Thank you for having me.